Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
It's really exciting to host you. What you write about is so super important and seems to be so ubiquitous. I find it funny, when I'm looking around and seeing other health influences out there, you hear all the buzzwords that everybody's talking about these days. So people are talking about biohacking, and they're talking about mitochondria as a word you hear all the time. And there's lots of different diets and things that people are doing and trying, and red light therapy. And it just kind of seems like not many people are talking about bones the way that you do. Yet, again, it seems so ubiquitous that people are having issues that they just kind of attribute to aging and just kind of think is really natural when it comes to their bone health.
Well, one of the, I think, challenges with our current medical system and culture in general in the US is that it's commonly believed that while getting older is inevitable, that aging is as well. And that it's this one way street of degeneration of all your systems throughout your body. And the reality is that there are many things people can do to increase their health span, improve their health span, improve their longevity. And bones is one of those, I think, canary in the coal mines is a silent disease, a silent issue where people aren't really paying attention to it. And it's something that even the medical community is mistreating and underdiagnosing and isn't really providing an approach to improve bone health in a way that not only improves just a number on a test, but significantly maintains bone strength so people don't fracture. And this is commonly considered a disease or a condition of women. It's most common in women. 80% of cases are in women. Most cases are in perimenopausal, postmenopausal women. Menopause and for the 10 years after is the fastest rate of bone loss. But it's a silent condition. And there are many people at much younger ages whose bones are getting weaker and they're not getting evaluated for it because there's a long list of medications that damage bone. There are lifestyle that people follow that damage bone, that put them in additional risks, and it's not being screened for, and it's not being properly approached and treated. Because if somebody breaks a bone, if you're a woman and you fracture a hip with osteoporosis, there's up to a 36% chance you're going to be dead within a year. And in fact, for women, the risk of an osteoporosis fracture is equal to her combined risk of breast, uterine, and ovarian cancer. And, God forbid, if you woman had breast cancer and fractures a hip and ends up in the hospital, there's an 83% chance, greater chance that she's going to die compared to a woman with breast cancer who doesn't fracture. And finally, every 30 seconds somewhere in the world, someone is breaking a bone due to fragile bones, due to poor bone health. So I'm on a mission. I'm passionate to get the word out, not only about this, so people get screened, because even with Medicare patients, that's 65 years and older, they're at the highest risk category. Over about 95% of Medicare patients aren't even getting screened for osteoporosis. And then when they do, and people get that diagnosis and they see that their bone density is going down or bone quality is decreasing, the conventional approach of simply just treating that number on the test is really missing the most important aspects when it comes to fracture risk, because breaking a bone is the most dangerous thing, not simply the number on a test.
Wow. Yeah, that's absolutely terrifying. And we know that's how people go out. And it seems to happen at younger and younger ages. Like you mentioned, you break the hip, you get into the hospital. Oftentimes you don't come out the way you mentioned, or, within a very short time that causes the deterioration that we see. And that's after, potentially decades of managing chronic disease. So, yeah, that's all very interesting. And I can't wait to get into more of how the medical industry has failed. We mentioned in the introduction, naturopathic medicine. We mentioned functional medicine. The things that you decided to get into tell us that you were already kind of wanting to do things in an unconventional way. Can you tell us your own personal story of how you wanted to get into medicine, and when was it that, I don't want to put words in your mouth or describe your experience, but did you at some point smell a rat with the medical system and want to do things a little bit differently and a little bit more unconventionally?
Well, I was interested for years in health, and I was, bike commuting to work. I was living in Seattle at the time. This is in my 30s. I was in my late 20s, actually, and early 30s. I was, as I said, bike commuting to work. I was loved gardening, and I was growing quite a bit of my own, vegetables that I would eat and store in the wintertime. And I was interested in herbs, and I have a degree in botany with an emphasis in economic botany. That's how cultures and people around the world use plants for medicine and commerce and in industry. And so I always was drawn to this integrative approach. And but that wasn't really my first love. Going back even further, my first degree is in literature. I mean, in my early 20s, I never saw myself taking this path in life. I was a journalist and decided that after working in that for a few years, I wanted to go back to school because I wanted to do more environmental writing, but I didn't have a science background. And I knew that I'd be more open to manipulation for my sources if I could not access and understand the primary data and ask the most important questions to really make sure that I was understanding what I was hearing and reading. So I went back to school after getting my undergraduate degree. I went back for another one at the University of Washington. I got a BS in botany. And during that time, I did my pre-medical, most of my pre-medical classes. And I decided as going through that, but at the end of it, I really didn't want the lifestyle of a journalist anymore. So I was kind of a bit lost looking for what to do. It was high tech jobs were plentiful at that time. And I ended up working in software as a technical and marketing writer for a while. And then I started to get sick. Which was not normal for me. So I went to a medical doctor that I just found that my insurance company would pay for as a list of doctors. I had no idea who this person was, and showed up in the office. And he walked into the exam room already with a prescription pad in hand. And I've since learned that actually about 75% of all primary care visits involve a prescription of a medication. So I walk in the room, I'm sitting there, he walks in with this prescription pad, and literally I believe it was no more than 7 minutes of an appointment. He wanted to write me a prescription and obviously get on to the next patient. But I wanted to ask questions and understand what was happening to my body. I wanted to understand what I could do and what was going on. And he obviously was a little frustrated by that. I took the prescription, but I never filled it. And I went down the street. I made an appointment to the teaching clinic at Bastyr University, which is a naturopathic medical school in the Seattle area. And having lived in Seattle for years, I knew some students, had met some students along the way who go there. I was very impressed by them. And I thought to myself, well, what do I have to lose? Let me see what these people have to say. I went and made an appointment, and they took about 45 minutes with me. I was very fortunate. The chief medical officer, Dr. Jamie Wallace, at the time was the primary physician who was supervising two student clinicians. And they spent time with me, answered all of my questions, helped me understand what I could do to improve my health. And they prescribed, some herbs and some lifestyle changes. But at the very end of the conversation, Dr. Wallace looked at me and he said, "You need to quit your job." He got to know me so well just in that appointment. And one of the philosophies of naturopathic medicine is treating the underlying cause. That he discovered and realized that the underlying cause of what was going on with me was chronic stress because I was in a career that I absolutely hated. The money was great. Don't get me wrong. I mean, being in high tech was great. And I was a manager at the time and managing projects, but I was miserable. And I heard it. I heard what he said and I agreed with it. I think it was that third party validation, that someone else outside of me, I think finally seeing me and recognizing what I needed and voicing it to me, that it just clicked. And the next week I left that job, left that career, started enrolling in naturopathic medical school. And I'd already been thinking about going back to school. Don't get me wrong. It was on my mind. I was already considering other options, and I really wasn't happy in the career that I had. But that was the kick in the butt that I needed to make me really make that final decision and change the trajectory of my life. I went
That
back to school.
is incredible. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I went back to school, and 4 years, it was a shock. It's like a splash of cold water in the face going from corporate America back to being a student. And during that time, I continued to research and write because it's what I love to do. Published my first medical article as a student in a medical journal in school, and continued just to try and understand and find solutions for problems people were struggling with.
It's an incredible story. And I'm just thinking how serendipitous it was that you decided to go and get a different opinion from what sounds to me like a completely different field. Like, of course, it's related in medical, but it's such a different approach. And you just think how many people out there have done exactly what you did. They go to the appointment trying to figure out what's wrong with them, and they just walk away thinking like, okay, well, this guy's a lot smarter than me. He gave me this piece of paper to go fill at my local pharmacy, so I'm just going to go do it. And they get stuck in that system and never really get to the root of their issues. I just think it's an amazing story that you were able to find something different, and the guy was bold enough to even say like, you should quit your job. It's pretty impressive.
Well, and I'm not alone, because I know in my own history in clinical practice, I can't tell you the number of times I've had patients say to me, "I should have come to you first instead of last." I've had patients go to Mayo Clinic and University of Washington, and all these really very prestigious with institutions with very smart people, but the paradigm through which they're viewing the human body, through which conventional medicine is approaching healthcare and promoting health, really is not in line with how the body works. Primarily, the conventional medical system is about symptom suppression, not only, and that's changing slowly, but primarily with the medications that are prescribed, it's primarily about symptom suppression. Something somebody's experiencing, for example, acid reflux, well, let's give them a pill to reduce the acid. Whereas the reality is the underlying cause of that might be somebody's actually producing too little acid. Acid in the stomach is a signal for the esophagus, the bottom of the esophagus, called the lower esophageal sphincter, to close and to separate the contents of the stomach from the throat. And so somebody is not producing enough acid, which is more common as people age, or if they have autoimmune conditions, or other diseases. Obviously, if they're on an acid blocking medication, they're not producing enough acid, and they can result in symptoms of acid reflux. And the fix to that is to help restore proper acid production if we can, because when you suppress the acid with a proton pump inhibitor, it increases the risk for intestinal dysbiosis. And now we know, even for osteoporosis and fractures, people take proton pump inhibitors for years at a time. And now we know it can increase the risk of hip fractures by 60% by taking those medications.
That's absolutely crazy. Okay, as you were practicing in your career, you're seeing more patients. How did you kind of hone your craft as far as it comes to bone and bone health? When did you start to realize that there's a huge issue here? Not a lot of people are talking about it. And again, kind of like we mentioned earlier in this conversation, people are associating poor bone health with, oh, this is just aging. This is just what happened to my dad and my aunt and whatever. How did you start to kind of refine your thinking around bones and bone health?
That's a great question. Early on in my career, I was doing, like any baby doc, new doctor out there, just what I was taught, and using integrative approaches, natural approaches, and people's bone density was going up, and so I was happy, and they were happy. My mother-in-law had osteoporosis at the time, and she was seeing a medical doctor. Her physician had her on Fosamax, and I was helping her with a little bit of nutritional recommendations and some dietary supplements and lifestyle recommendations. And her bone density was going up. So, she was happy, her physician was happy, and I was happy. But then she tripped on a throw rug in her house and broke her hip. And I thought to myself, something is wrong with this picture. Now, granted, this is in about 2006. And during that time, working with her and seeing that those test results go up, I was as convinced as the vast majority of doctors are still today, that is what is required to protect patients. Let's just improve that number on a test. But what happened is I dove into the research, because I thought to myself, something's wrong with this picture. And what I discovered just absolutely shocked me, that we've known since the 1990s in the research that a bone density test predicts less than half of people who will fracture. And then a study came out a couple of years later, after my mother-in-law fractured in 2008, showing that for women with osteoporosis, a bone density test only predicts 44% of them who will fracture and only 21% of men. And so looking at that, it became very clear that bone density is only one small piece of a much larger puzzle when it comes to improving bone strength and also reducing fracture risk. And that is what's missing. And still today, almost myopically, that number on the test is what is discussed and focused on almost exclusively.
Okay. Well, okay. So recently I got a DEXA scan and they told me, again, it's based on a score. They told me what my bone density was. It came out pretty good. Feeling pretty good about that. Can you tell us, like, what is the standardized test for measuring bone density? I'm not even fully aware. Is what I got with a DEXA test, is that considered like a standard, or are there other standards that are used to measure and quite inaccurately from the sounds of it?
So it's not that it's inaccurate, it's that it has limited predictive value.
Mm,
It has some value, and I think they're important to get, and I like to see them improve, but it's equally important to make sure that people are doing other things as well to improve their bone health and their bone strength. So the bone density test is the dual X-ray absorptiometry test. It's called DEXA, and it's an X-ray, is the gold standard. It's been the gold standard for decades. All other machinery, all other tests that have been created since then are compared to the bone density test, and none have been shown to be more predictive at fractures, better at predicting fractures. So with you, it's interesting that you said that you got a test. I mean, this is going to be a great conversation because many times the clinicians aren't really sure how to interpret the test results and what to do with them. And this is not my opinion. There's a study that was published that showed this. So let me ask you a question. How old are you?
I just turned 42 yesterday.
Okay. And did you review the test results, the DEXA test results with your clinician?
No, not with a clinician. I got it done at a third party where a technician did the test. She did my test last year. We did it again this year. We probably spent a good 45 seconds going over the results, and she gave me the form, and that was fine. Yeah.
And what did she focus on in terms of the results, if you don't mind me asking?
No, please. I love this. We talked about the body fat, where that number was, how it compared to the averages. And then it was just really like the whole thing was probably 45 seconds and really a flyby. She just told me this number. I can't even remember the number. It was like 2 on a certain scale. And like, oh, you're in the 97 percentile. So this is great. It's the same as it was last year. So you're doing pretty well. And that was the end of the conversation that we had.
So the DEXA test actually, this is a great conversation because the DEXA test can test more than just bone. And many clinicians, you mentioned percent body fat, so it can do a body composition analysis, which sounds like what you had done. Now, as an add-on, they can then add on a bone density component to that, which I believe it sounds like you may have had as well. But if they focused on the bone density test results, provide two categories of numbers. One is called a T score and the other is called a Z score. A T score compares somebody's bone density to someone of the same gender, so man or woman, as the patient in their 20s. So if I'm a 65-year-old woman, Caucasian, white woman, my T score compares my bone density to that of a 20 to 29-year-old white young woman as well.
Interesting.
Now, that's important to know because some clinicians don't understand that a T score is not valid for premenopausal women and men and women younger than 50 years old. So the T score is meaningless for people under 50, like yourself.
Wow.
There's another score that's provided. It's called the Z score for people, premenopausal women and men and women younger than 50. The Z score is what we want to focus on. The Z score gives somebody's bone density compared to somebody of the same sex in the same age range. So it's more apples to apples comparison. And if a T score is low, less than, minus 2.5, less than minus 2, depending on, there are different there are recommendations out there, and then there are, clinicians, kind of judgment as well. I like if it's lower than minus 2.0. I want to, it's the protocols out there call for investigating for secondary causes of bone loss if somebody has a low Z score. So there's primary osteoporosis, primary bone loss, and secondary bone loss. Primary bone loss is caused by age, what's considered normal aging, like the loss of estrogen, the decrease in estrogen as women go through menopause is the main driver of bone loss in that age group. For men, as testosterone decreases as we age, which also causes a decrease in estradiol. We do have some estradiol or estrogen in our bodies as well, which is important for bone health. That can also cause bone loss. That's primary osteoporosis. Secondary osteoporosis is osteoporosis caused by other things, like medications that I alluded to and mentioned the proton pump inhibitors. But there's a long list of many other medications that do that. Doctors are prescribing these medications unwittingly without knowing that it's actually damaging bone and increasing people's fractures risks. Chronic inflammation, inflammatory diseases, gastrointestinal diseases like irritable bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, those cause bone loss. Autoimmune diseases can cause bone loss. There's a long list of other causes and other diseases that contribute to bone loss, osteoporosis, and fracture risk. And so for you, looking at those DEXA tests, I would, if they did have a bone density component that they added on to the body analysis, body composition analysis, I would be looking at the Z score.
Fascinating. I had no idea. I just learned way more about those scores than I had learned previously from doing those two appointments. So I really, really appreciate that. Makes me want to stop the appointment right here, or interview right now, and just go dig into my email to find those results. But that's absolutely fascinating. As far as the Z score goes, is it when it's comparing you to a like kind of population, gender, and age group? Is it comparing you to like the average person out there, or is it comparing you to like a healthy population, if that makes sense? Like the way that cholesterol metrics have changed so much in the past years, and like we're kind of moving the goalposts on certain things. Is the same thing happening when you talk about like the T score and the Z score?
No, I mean the T score, it comes down to really what's normal and what's healthy, and those definitions and how laboratory reference ranges are created. And basically, when they created these reference ranges, and this was defined by the World Health Organization in the 1990s, so this is not new. They basically look at a bunch of different bone density tests. Let's say 100. I'm making up that number, but let's say you look at 100 tests and you ascribe some statistical analysis to it. And by definition, 2.5% on the high end are going to be abnormally high, 2.5% on the low end are going to be abnormally low, and then the rest are considered normal. That's the normal range. When it comes to bone density tests, the T and the Z score are defined by negative numbers. So if you look at sort of that average, that middle number on a test range, they look at a standard deviation. So a certain percentage, a number of points below that normal, that sort of middle value of normal, how far below that, how many standard deviations below that are you? And that's what the T and the Z score numbers represent, which is why they're shown as negative numbers.
Yeah. Okay. I see. That makes so much more sense. Thank you for clarifying all that. I really, really appreciate that. We've talked about the medical system. We've talked about medications. I do actually have a question on medications. You said there's many, many different medications. Are there some that are worth the trade-off, in your opinion, for somebody who is dealing with something where, yes, we want to medicate this person to deal with this because this is way more serious and we're willing to take on some of these side effects? Or for the most part, is it just not, the juice is just not worth the squeeze with so many of these medications?
No, there absolutely are medications that people should be taking. I think that in many cases, like the proton pump inhibitors, like with serotonin, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, antidepressants in that category. Now we know people taking an SSRI like, Prozac, Lexapro, those types of medications. For every 19 women taking them for 1 to 5 years, we now expect one of them to fracture. And those medications are just given out literally like candy. And similar with proton pump inhibitors, when there are well documented, effective, integrative, and natural ways to approach improving somebody's mood and improving somebody's digestion. And look, it's not 100%, nothing is. And there's probably will be some segment of the population that are, you still need to be on those medications. But I think those are two examples of medications that are uh, that are not needed. And in fact, there was a study that looked at medications in I believe, is the elderly population, by definition over 65, showed that at least a third of those medications probably were not necessary. And so, when when you're a hammer, everything's a nail. And in the conventional medical system, when the protocols are first line therapy is to prescribe a medication instead of do diet and lifestyle changes and nutritional medicine, well, that's going to be what people get. That's the service that they're going to get. They're going to get the medication. Now, there are medications that I think are absolutely, of course, should be taken and are important. Like if you have an estrogen receptor positive cancer, aromatase inhibitors, the data on aromatase inhibitors are phenomenal in terms of helping with that. But there is a side effect of 20% of women taking an aromatase inhibitor for 5 years will fracture. So that's and the majority of women on an aromatase inhibitor are not getting screened with bone density tests at a baseline and follow-up tests per the guidelines. So it's important for people just to educate themselves and advocate for screening and find out what they can do from a more holistic and integrative approach to not just improve the number on the test, but reduce their fracture risk. Because as I've mentioned several times, fracture risk depends on factors, a lot of factors other than the bone density test result.
Yeah, got it. Okay. And you mentioned lifestyle and nutrition. And, I would hope our audience would kind of already understand what are some of the things that we have been doing in the last, 50 years, 100 years that got us to this point today. I think many of them would be blaming, things like ultra processed food or sugar. And you have a whole chapter in your book about the osteoporosis diet. Can you tell us, in your opinion, what has been some of the things that we've done nutritionally that got us to where we are today with such poor bone health for most people?
Well, I think ultra processed food is definitely part of that picture. Now, 70% of packaged foods in U.S. supermarkets are considered ultra processed foods, and about 60% of calories in the American diet now are ultra processed foods, and that is associated not only with osteoporosis, but consuming those foods more than 10% of calories as ultra processed foods. So let me make sure people understand this. So it's what's called a dose response relationship. It's not that taking one bite of an ultra processed food is going to be a problem. It's, are you exposing yourself over time to what I consider environmental toxins? I think ultra processed foods are environmental toxins. And what's the dose? How much are you eating? And how long are you being exposed to that? So what the research shows is, as I mentioned, about 60% of calories in the American diet are from ultra processed foods. And repeatedly with different studies, it's showing that threshold for being associated with all of these chronic degenerative diseases like breast cancer and cancer mortality and Alzheimer's disease and cardiovascular disease and diabetes and obesity and osteoporosis, that minimum threshold appears to be about 10% of calories. So people are getting already 6 times that on average in their diet. So reducing ultra processed foods, I think, is really important. But the standard American diet in general is also creating osteoporosis because it is very low in fruits and vegetables. It's very high in packaged foods, processed foods, fried foods. And what we know is the opposite to that is the Mediterranean dietary pattern. That Mediterranean dietary pattern is more of a plant-forward diet with plenty of protein and whole grains and fruits and vegetables. That is associated with a 20% reduction in osteoporosis risk and about a 20% reduction in hip fracture risk. So dietary modification and eating to promote somebody's health, I think, is really crucial. Other things that Americans are doing is being sedentary. The majority of adults in the US don't exercise regularly, and that is a risk factor for osteoporosis and fractures, because one of the biggest risks for fractures is falling. 95% of fractures occur because somebody falls. And as people get older, and if they're not exercising and not getting enough protein to maintain or build muscle, they become weaker. They become more frail. Their gait and their mobility, their stability all decline, which increases their risk for falls and fractures. And so that's also really important. Sleep is another problem. Sleep is decreased by about 20% in sort of our modern society compared to, I think, maybe 80, 100 years ago. And that's because part of it is we have 24-hour electricity and we're wired on the internet 24 hours a day. And what the research shows is that people who are not getting enough sleep, about 6 hours a night, less than 6 hours a night on average, have a much faster rate of bone loss. And in the United Kingdom, a study was done that showed that 17% of all incident fractures occur were the result of people having sleep problems, sleep issues, because being sleep deprived, research shows, is as dangerous as drunk driving when it comes to people's coordination.
That's right.
All right. So that's another issue. Sleep is another issue and another problem. And so I think those are three important categories that people have a lot of control over. What they put in their mouth, how they spend their time, and how they move their body.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. This is going to give us a lot of great insight to be able to pick apart here. If you had one kind of, macronutrient, I guess, to focus on with most people, I think you already mentioned it. Would you say that protein is probably the thing that is most lacking in most people's diets, and the thing that you would want to ratchet up the most?
No, I don't. I think that the American diet on average is really poor. I think that there's a lack of fruits and vegetables, which provide the vitamins, minerals, and other plant nutrients that our body, our biochemistry needs to operate and thrive, and that our bones absolutely need. And then there is protein. So I think they're equally important to focus on. And in my book, I talk about people just focusing on plants and protein. And I recommend people get about 30 grams of total dietary fiber per day from whole foods, the fruits, whole fruits and vegetables, because not only are those going to have the nutrients, but the fiber itself is healthy. It helps to regulate blood sugar, and it helps to modulate the microbiome in a direction that provides, creates a healthier gut environment and healthier bacteria. And then protein. I do think people in general, despite the protein craze and how popular high protein is now, what I see over and over, even when people are doing everything right, they're following my instructions, they read my book, they're implementing a holistic, plan, and their bone density still isn't going up. Because like I said, I do want to see that number move. Repeatedly, when I talk to them, what I find out is that protein piece of the puzzle seems to be the missing component. So the amount of protein somebody consumes, that alone can account for 2 to 3% of bone mineral density. And so I recommend people take their body weight and multiply it by 0.6. If their body weight, they're doing pounds, not kilograms, body weight in pounds, by 0.6. And that's the minimum number of grams of protein somebody should consume a day. And ideally, I tell them I'd like them to get maybe about 10% more than that. And when they're doing that, and they're taking the supplements that I recommend, and they're taking the modifying their lifestyle, and again, they're very motivated. It's a scary diagnosis. It's a scary condition. People really want to improve. And then when they add that protein piece to it, oftentimes that's when we see the bone density go up when it hadn't before.
Got it. Okay, awesome. And I'm just curious, your own like personal thoughts on this. You're talking to, I personally have been on a carnivore diet for almost 7 years. A lot of our audience has been on carnivore diets. Do you get nervous when you hear about people on carnivore diets and who are choosing not to do the fiber, not to do the plant, nutrients? Does that make you nervous, especially in the long term?
Yes, it does.
Fair. Yeah, that's totally fair. I wanted to ask you about supplementation. I think most people would think about bone health and they would think about calcium as the number one thing that they would need to take. Of course, you hear lots of different opinions on calcium supplementation. Vitamin D is another one that we hear bone health, so super important for developing bones to get your vitamin D. But, people are kind of afraid of the sun and they don't want to get as much sunshine as they need. So the supplementations that you recommend, how are you able to make good recommendations, excuse me, and know what things will help benefit people the most?
Great question. So I take all of my recommendations from the peer reviewed medical research and literature. Everything that I'm about to say is on PubMed, PubMed is the National Library of Medicine's definitive database for peer-reviewed journals. And what I did is I looked at the nutrients and I asked myself the question, which nutrients have been shown to reduce fractures, not just improve bone density, but reduce fractures. Like ideally, we'll see the bone density go up, but most importantly, which nutrients as dietary supplements have been shown to reduce fractures. And there are only four. So calcium and vitamin D are two of them, and they really both need to be there and balanced. And calcium is often just a blanket recommendation. I still see it, physicians saying take 1,000 milligrams or 1,200 milligrams of calcium as a dietary supplement. I've even seen recommendations as high as 1,500 milligrams of calcium as a dietary supplement. And I think those are poor recommendations. The recommendation for how much calcium somebody should get should be based on the USRDA for calcium, which in adult women is 1,200 milligrams per day. And for men, it's 1,000 milligrams per day. But you need to take diet into account because people are getting calcium from their diet as well. So the average American woman gets about 800 milligrams of calcium in her diet, which means that taking a supplement with maybe 400 milligrams of calcium is sufficient to get her into that 1,200 milligram range. There's no evidence that getting higher than 1,200 milligrams is more beneficial, is better for bone health. And in fact, the position statement of the Bone Health and Osteoporosis Foundation, and for full disclosure, I'm on the corporate advisory roundtable for that nonprofit, and the American College for Preventative Cardiology, their current recommendations on the safety of calcium is that people should not consume more than 2,000 to 2,500 milligrams per day total, because then they run the risk of some cardiovascular risks. But if you're getting 400 milligrams from a supplement, you're nowhere near that risk if you're eating an average diet. If you're on a calcium restricted diet, maybe you don't eat dairy, maybe you, for some reason you just are getting less, then perhaps 1,000 milligrams of calcium as a dietary supplement would be a good choice. And research shows up to 1,000 milligrams as a dietary supplement to be safe. But more than that, I have concerns about, and it should be customized per somebody's need. For men, because men get an average of 1,000 milligrams of calcium in their diet per day in the US, a lot of men won't need additional calcium as a dietary supplement. Now, multivitamins typically going to have some calcium, and that's fine. Most of the time, it's negligible and not really anything to be worried about. But in terms of a bone health product and approach, I don't advocate as a blanket statement, men should be getting 1,000 milligrams or 800 milligrams of calcium. Like there's just not a one size fits all here. And I think a customized approach based on the person's individual needs is best. And for vitamin D, similarly, what we see with vitamin D is that there is a range of vitamin D concentration in the body that is associated with maximum fracture reduction. So in vitamin D levels, serum vitamin D levels are 30 to 44 nanograms per milliliter. That's how the blood work is reported on a test. That's associated with maximum hip fracture reduction and maximum fall risk reduction. And so to get to that level, the research shows that 2,000 IUs of vitamin D per D3 per day as a dietary supplement are sufficient to get most people into that range. Now, many clinicians, myself included, like to see that number higher on blood work for immune health and for other benefits. But when we're just talking about a bone health supplement, 2,000 IUs per day is a good recommendation for the majority of people. And so that's how I think about calcium and vitamin D. And the other two nutrients that have been shown to reduce fractures, maintain bone strength, are a specific form of vitamin K called MK4. It's a form of vitamin K2. And vitamin K is a category of different vitamin K molecules. It's not just one vitamin. So there's vitamin K1, which comes from green leafy vegetables. And then vitamin K2 is a category, and it has different types of vitamin K2 in it, probably about a dozen. And those are designated by numbers. So MK4 and MK7 are two types of vitamin K2 that you might find in dietary supplements. And for full disclosure, you mentioned my company. I do have a product that uses the MK4, does not use the MK7, and for the following reasons. So I asked myself again the question, what does the research show in terms of which nutrient maintains bone strength? And the most sensitive indicator, the best indicator of bone strength, is whether somebody breaks a bone in prospective clinical trials. So MK7 in all doses, first of all, has not been shown to improve bone density, only slow down how fast somebody loses bone. And in one study of high dose MK7, the women taking it lost bone density at their hip faster than the women not taking the MK7.
Wow.
And there are no studies showing that it maintains bone strength, meaning there are no studies showing MK7 reduces fractures in clinical trial volunteers. Vitamin K1, also, there have been two clinical trials on vitamin K1. Both of them showed no benefit in terms of improving bone density. And one of those studies looked at fractures, and there was no benefit in terms of fractures either. Because like, if you change one atom in a molecule, one carbon atom or one group of atoms, you get overlapping benefits and actions in the body, but you also get very different ones. And that's what we see here. This is a great example of that. Because when you look at MK4, which is another form of vitamin K2, there are over, there are dozens of clinical trials and studies on it. What we see repeatedly in the clinical trials that looked at postmenopausal women with osteoporosis, they took 45 milligrams of MK4 per day in divided doses. That bone density consistently stabilized and improved in those women. But in addition to that, and most importantly, it maintained bone strength as indicated by over 70% fewer fractures in clinical trials. And then when MK4 is combined with vitamin D3, it had a synergistic effect on bone density. Bone density increased even greater than taking the MK4 alone. So that's why in my products, I've got three different versions of the product, all with the base formula of MK4, 45 milligrams per day, and vitamin D3, and then different amounts of calcium. 1,000 milligrams of calcium for people who need more, 400 milligrams of calcium for people who don't need as much, and then a calcium-free version, so for people who don't need calcium at all. And been so convinced, working with these nutrients and this research and lecturing on this for 2 decades now, and the products being on the market for bone health for about that long as well, that we now guarantee it. My company guarantees that people taking any one of my bone support formulas, of NBI's bone support formulas, will see their bone density stabilize or improve within 6 months. But most importantly, they will maintain bone strength, meaning if somebody breaks a bone, we will refund their money for all qualifying purchases between their bone density tests. Wow. Now, they should be doing other things too. No pill is the best, there's not a magic bullet out there, but these very powerfully promote bone health and healthy bone physiology. They're not medications. They're not approved by the FDA to, treat diseases, but they very powerfully push the biochemistry in the direction of bone health and in terms of promoting and supporting bone density and maintaining bone strength.
Wow. Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. It's cool to have all those different options, and the guarantee, speaks for itself. Anybody could try the product and make sure that it's working. I think that's fantastic. You mentioned the vitamin D. Does your vitamin D recommendations depend on seasonality, somebody's outdoor exposure and sunlight, latitude? People might be tracking using an app to see, like, okay, I've got this much skin exposed in March when it's springtime. Do you take that into effect, and does that change the vitamin D recommendations, or is that just kind of gravy on top?
It changes maybe the testing recommendations. So the vitamin D recommendations are going to be based on the test results in general. I think people routinely should be getting their vitamin D tested with their annual exams. But yes, so vitamin D exposure, vitamin D production in the body occurs when you have sunlight. It also can be in some foods, but it's primarily when sunlight hits the skin. And even in latitudes where there's a lot of sun exposure, like Southern California or Arizona, people tend to be indoors or covered up. And so even those are not getting the exposure that's needed. And in more northern latitudes, you're talking about from about Santa Cruz, California, cutting across the country north of there. In the winter, the sun doesn't get high enough in the sky to activate the vitamin D receptors anyway. So I think the recommendation is really based on the season, but in general, that 2,000 IUs of vitamin D for bone health does it shouldn't matter the season that somebody's in, but whether they need to have more to get to that higher level, 60, 70, or 80 for immune health and immune support and other benefits, that dosing and the amount to provide, I think, is dependent on the individual and also on their medical history. If there is a malabsorption issue, people who are obese, they're going to need more vitamin D to get to those higher levels.
Got it. Okay, perfect. That's a great answer. And you mentioned so many different lifestyle aspects. You write about all of them in your book. I like that you have an entire chapter about Zen in your book, and stress reduction and sleep, and all these things are just so critical. For my last question, I'm just going to choose one of them, and I'm going to choose exercise. And I would just say, if somebody said to me, like, okay, this stuff's important, I'm going to exercise, but I'm only going to do this one thing, whatever it is. I'm going to maybe walk a mile. I'm going to do Zumba. I'm going to whatever. I'm only going to do this. I'm not going to do anything else. I'm going to say, great, go ahead, go and do that thing. That's at least better than nothing. I'm happy you're exercising. For somebody that says, like, okay, I want to exercise, but I want to do the very most important kind. I want to make sure I'm being most efficient with my time. What's the most important thing that I can do? What would you answer as far as like exercise for bone health? What would you want people to be doing ideally if they were going to take on exercise?
So ideally, I'm going to answer this a little bit differently because the best exercise, in my opinion, are ones that are first safe and that somebody will consistently do over time. It takes time to build bone. It takes time to build muscle and strength. And so those are the first requirements. And also to understand that people can change over time. If you get bored, do something different. There's so many options of what people can do. So, even just walking, if somebody's interested in all they want to do is walk, that's great. Because if you walk 7,000 to 7,500 steps per day on average, that's associated with a 50 to 70% reduction in all-cause mortality. That's caused, death from everything, including, which would also include from, breaking your hip. Now, in terms of strength and stability, there are also many things that people can do. There is, gentle yoga, and that needs to be modified though, because doing the wrong exercise, doing a good exercise in the wrong way can actually increase your risk for fractures. So make sure that you're working with a trainer or somebody who understands how to modify it, or there are resources and books out there who can help you learn how to modify yoga poses. And then resistance exercise, if people are interested in going to a gym, are phenomenal, doing high intensity resistance exercises. But even that, you have to be very careful of and not increase the weights too quickly, and really focus for quite a while on form before putting more weight, because you don't want to injure yourself. And so working with a trainer is really, really important.
We're going to have to send you a check for commissions for recommending personal trainers since we've been doing personal training for combined over 30 years. It's so important. And I would have said, early on in my career 2 decades ago, like, getting strong is super important and you've got to throw weights around and jump around and whatever. But that injury risk is so, so important. I'm so glad that you led off with the number one priority. The first thing that you should do is make sure this is safe and make sure this is sustainable. And people think like, okay, there's this principle in training where there's progressive resistance and you want to make sure that things are getting harder and you're getting stronger. But there's so many millions of ways to be able to do that is totally safe. It's not just adding more weight all the time. It's like you can add time. There's so many other things to think about, and doing it safely is such a high priority. So I absolutely love that. I think that's something that can make it really accessible for people, whether they're in a gym, whether they're at home, whatever equipment they have, to be able to do some safe exercise and resistance training. It also would be my number one priority, with walking being
Absolutely.
right up there. Those are my two favorite things. I love that.
You and I are totally aligned in all of that. And I would just add one thing, and then I tell people, speed is not your friend. Slow and steady wins the race. And
Totally.
That comes to both creating a program for yourself that is sustainable over time. Major changes done quickly tend not to be sustainable, which is why, when I'm helping people and in my book, I'm recommending how they can transition into eating healthy for life to promote their health, not just their bone health, but the recommendations also reduce the risk for cardiovascular disease and dementia and diabetes and cancer risk and all of that. But transitioning into it over a period of time that is comfortable, so that it becomes a habit. And same with exercise. these New Year's resolutions that people have, where suddenly they're get a spurt of motivation. Gyms actually really rely on that for their revenue every year because they see these memberships go up, and then by the end of February, March, a lot of those people just don't go to the gym anymore. And so slow and steady wins the race, and developing habits where exercise, it becomes just part of your life, and finding something that you enjoy or that you can commit to doing. And if you don't like it anymore, that you give yourself permission to change so you don't feel stuck. And having that flexibility is really important for long-term success.
You couldn't have said that better. What a great way to end this conversation. I love that, and totally support all of that. I really appreciate. This conversation was just an absolute flyby of your work. There's so many more things that we could talk about. I would definitely recommend anybody go out and get your book because you did such a great job writing it. I love how you cover so many different things. And again, that kind of approach of like, let's just develop these habits slowly over time, add them in. You kind of forget some of the good habits you've already put in your life were developed that way to begin with, and you might not even think about the things that you're doing now that are healthy, and you can just continue doing that and see. This is something that's just so critical. Again, focusing on fractures versus focusing on test results and whatever for bone health. I just think is so wonderful. You did an amazing job. I've really loved this conversation. Dr. John Neustadt, where can people go to find you and connect with you and your work? Where can they find your supplements, and also where can they find the book?
Thank you for asking. Everything is on my website, nbihealth.com. NBI stands for Nutritional Biochemistry Incorporated. It's nbihealth.com.
Awesome. We will link that in the show notes so everybody can find those products and get their hands on your book. For now, we're just really grateful for you and all the work you've done in this field, and to be able to bring a really nuanced approach to all of this and to make it accessible for people, I think is really, really helpful. So thank you so very much for your amazing mission and all the work you've done in your career. And thank you for taking time out of your very, very busy day to come chat with us here today. We really appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciated the opportunity. Thank you.
Absolutely. It was an honor to host you. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.